Yo and hello my friends, and welcome back to another episode of the League of Fantasy Legends podcast. I am your host, Chris Benedict, aka Pistons Wish. We've got an amazing episode here where we're going to hand out the LFL Pod Awards. They are FantasyLCS Awards for the Summer 2022 Split. I'm so excited to hand them out. Here to do it with me once again, it's Ferris Biscuit. How are you, brother?
Doing very well, getting back into the swing of things after being away for a week, but I'm looking forward to the award show.
I hope you had a great vacation, a little time off. We're getting back into it. We've got a bunch of different awards we're going to hand out today, and I'm super excited about it. The way we did it, we took 1/3 of my vote, we took 1/3 of Biscuit's vote, we took 1/3 of a Twitter vote. Those of you who voted, we really appreciate it. And so we'll go ahead and get right into it, handing out some awards. What do you think?
Let's get into it.
All right. The first award of the 2022 LFL Pod Awards. I think we need a better name for that, by the way. We should come up with a nickname. But the Fantasy Match of the Year. This is the match that produced the best fantasy output for both teams. Maybe it was a close game all the way. Maybe it was a comeback. It was definitely a long game. The nominees. In Week 8, Game 3, Dignitas versus Golden Guardians. It was the huge Dignitas throw. Do you remember this one, Biscuit?
I sure do. How could I forget?
It's the one that got Golden Guardians into playoffs, ruined the hope for Dignitas. They combined 341 points in that game. For reference, the average combined score was 220. The second nominee, FlyQuest versus CLG, a combined total of 382 points, and this game had a backdoor, so I think it could have been even better. The third nominee, Evil Geniuses versus CLG, Week 2, Game 2. This is the game that CLG took down EG with that ridiculous base defense right as the Elder Dragon was expiring. I've never seen anything like it. A combined total of 336 points this game. Biscuit, who got your vote?
So my vote is going to go to FlyQuest versus CLG from that Week 7 Game 2 matchup. I think this is pretty much the epitome of Fantasy League in a nutshell here, right? We have two teams who you didn't really know what you're going to get from them week to week. So at any point when these two type of teams clash and they just both happen to go off, it's going to lead to big numbers, right? So that's why I'm going with FlyQuest versus CLG from that Week 7 matchup.
You know, I don't like to agree with you most of the time. I think it's more fun when we fight. But I don't think there's any fighting to be had here. The combined total in this game, 382, 40 points better than the next best game on the split. This is the game that held the huge score from Takui's Zoe, where he broke 60 points in a losing effort. And I can just imagine if the game ended with a team fight instead of a backdoor, there could have been another 50 or 60 points on this game. I think this is, hands down, the game of the year. And the potty goes to FlyQuest versus CLG, like we both said.
I am 100% in for the potty. Let's get on to sitting on the next one.
That was disgusting. The second potty award. It's the most improved player. This one's simple. Who improved the most from last split to this split? The nominees. Jojo Pyun. Now I know you're thinking, he's always been good, right? But when you look at it from a fantasy perspective, in the spring, he finished 4th, but was just a fraction of a point above 6th at 24 points per game. This split, first place, a point and a half clear of second, 31.5 points per game. The second nominee, from CLG, it's Contracts. Contracts, the spring split, finished as the 9th jungler at 18.7 points per game. Now, the 5th jungler at 25.3, an increase of almost 7 points per game. The third nominee, Palafox. Again from CLG, he was the worst mid laner in the spring. In the summer, he was 5th, an increase from 19.7 points per game to 26, again almost 6.5 points per game. Biscuit, who gets your vote?
So for my vote, I'm going to go outside the box here a little bit and say Palafox. I just think that going from 10th overall to 5th is just a massive increase, especially with the point differential from a fantasy perspective. That is just definitely a massive increase, like we already mentioned. And I think we can expect some good things going into, not only the rest of the playoffs, but into spring 23. So it will be interesting to keep an eye on him and see how much more he improves, to see if he can get into the upper echelon and even further into the top mid laners in the league then.
I really like Palafox, and I think he's very deserving, but I'm going to go with Contracts, staying within CLG. I think Contracts, in a real-life perspective, was just terrible in the spring, and for him to be able to use that early aggression but really fine-tune it, the amount of first bloods he had this split was insane, and that's so valuable from a fantasy perspective, and he actually jumped very slightly more in points per game, even though his ranking wasn't quite as big of a jump as Palafox. But for that reason, I'm going with Contracts. And the Poddy goes to... It's Contracts with 63% of the Twitter vote. Do you accept that one? Is that one okay for you?
I can agree with that one. I think that's a good call.
The third award, kind of changing tune a little bit. It's the most disappointing player. This is the player that let you down. He ruined your draft. He didn't live up to expectations. The nominees. First is TSM Tactical. Tactical was the consensus number 5 ADC in the preseason. He was picked ahead of Luger. He was picked ahead of Johnson. Expectations were high. And yet, he was a full 7 points per game behind 6th as the number 7 ADC, which means he was really not startable almost the entire time. The next nominee is Closer. Closer, by all intentions, he had a great split. The team got second. And yet, from a fantasy perspective, he really wasn't that great. He was the number 1 picked jungler by average draft position. And yet he finished number 4, a full 6.5 points per game behind first place. And he absolutely did not return on his top 5 pick from 32.5 points per game to 26 points per game. And third nominee, Immortals Ignar. Now, the expectations on Ignar weren't that high, but he underwhelmed even those low expectations. He was the worst fantasy player that I've seen since I've started keeping stats at 11.7 points per game. That was 4 points per game than the next lowest player since I've been keeping track. He was my preseason number 6 support, and needless to say, he did not come close to living to that. Biscuit, who do you have here?
Yeah, so for those who know me, I'm definitely all about the numbers. So when you see the numbers that Ignar put up this split, they were definitely just abysmal. So I'm going to go with Ignar for this Poddy award. I'm not sure how much worse it could possibly get going into next split, so definitely keep an eye out. I wouldn't even keep him on maybe your flyers list. Just hope for the best for Ignar and hope things get better again going into spring 23.
I think that's a really good call. I'm going to be a little bit of a contrarian. I'm going to make an argument for Closer. And the thing is, Closer was okay. He averaged 26 points per game, but that was such a huge drop off from the 32.5 that he averaged in the spring. And for someone like me who took him, I think, number 4 overall, that was just really disappointing. And so my vote for this award went to Closer. And the Poddy goes to... It's Ignar with 75% of the Twitter vote. He wins the most disappointing player of the split.
So moving on from the most disappointing player, we have our performance of the year. So this is going to be the top fantasy performance overall that led players to a fantasy championship here. So starting off, we have Jensen on Anivia versus Immortals in week 8. He went 11-0-9, having 10 bonus points for a total score of 65.87 points during that matchup against Immortals. So moving on from there, we did have Fudge on the Gangplank versus TSM, and where he went 8-0-8. He did have 14 bonus points for a total score of 59.2, again against TSM in that matchup. And then from there, we did have FBI on Sivir versus Cloud9 in week 7, where he did go 12-0-8. And did have 381 CS getting also 2 bonus points for a total score of 58.8. And then finally, we had Takui on Zoe versus CLG in an actual loss, the only loss on this list we have here. Again, in week 7, he went 12-3-9 for 4 bonus points and 60.19 points overall, again, in that week 7 loss to CLG. So for this one, just going over the list again, definitely some top performances throughout the entire fantasy season. Which one did you feel was the most important to winning a championship, or during the championship run, I should say?
Yeah, this one was really, really hard for me because, well, first of all, I'm such an Anivia fan that I was so excited to see Anivia played, and then to see it pop off and have the highest point total of the entire split in a single game was awesome. So props to Jensen for that. But I think just looking at the most impressive game for me, I'm going to go with Takui on his Zoe. It was week 7, so it was the first week of playoffs. And, he may or may not have been started, but depending on how you thought that game was going to go against CLG. But he popped off with 12-3-9. It was only 4 bonus points, so he earned those points. For a 60.19, it was the second highest point total behind the Anivia game, but it was in a loss. I voted for Takui's Zoe.
I think that's a good good way to look at it there for sure. I think that's definitely something that people are going to remember, whether or not they lost or won. Hopefully they won in this case with that Takui performance. But I'm actually going to take a different route. I think it was actually more of FBI on Sivir against Cloud9, just because if you take a look at the other matchups that, Jensen and Fudge had, I feel like Cloud9 was obviously the better of the opponents out of those 3. So I'm going to go FBI, who went 12-0-8, getting that 58.8 score for my performance of the year. That hopefully led, again, those players who had FBI to a championship. But when it came to the final vote, actually, you already touched on it. Jensen on Anivia was the winner, again, in our vote, obtaining 63% of the vote. He went 11-0-9 once more versus Immortals in that Week 8 performance that will not soon be forgotten.
It's hard to look away from the highest point total of the whole split coming in the championship week. It reminds me of Alvin Kamara scoring 7 touchdowns on Christmas Day to take me down in a loss to my wife. Yeah, I'll never live that one down in this house. The next award is the Playoff Performer of the Year. This was the league winner. This was the player who showed out in the playoffs and carried your team to the championship. Now, when I mentioned total points here, this is the total points over the last 2 weeks, which includes 5 games. The nominees. First, FBI averaged 40 points per game, a total of 203 points in the last 2 weeks. The second nominee, Santorin. He was the second highest scoring player, 180.3 total points. That's an average of 36.6 points per game. The third nominee is Instinct from TSM. He had a total of 145.5 points, average of 29 points per game. He was by far the best player out of anyone that was not in those top 4 teams. So if you didn't have one of those top players, Instinct might have helped you get to the title. The fourth nominee is Huhi. He was the third highest scoring player, and that came from the support position. He had a total of 176, which averaged out to 35 points per game. Biscuit, who was your choice in this one?
So my choice is actually going to be Huhi. I know it's a little bit unconventional given the other players that we had mentioned here, but definitely going to go Huhi on this one just because I think that amount of points for support is massive in getting your team, to the championship and winning it there. So I'm going to go Huhi from 100 Thieves for my vote for this one.
Yeah, I think that's super fair, especially when you look at when you could have drafted these players. FBI in my leagues went number 1 overall. Huhi went in the 3rd or 4th round. So an incredible value there. I wanted to speak to Instinct because I think this was an incredible playoff performance from a player that you wouldn't have expected it from. The only problem is, because you wouldn't have expected it, I don't think very many people reaped the rewards. He was better than Johnson. He was better than Luger. He was better than Lost. He was better than all these guys, but I bet you didn't play him. So I don't think he can win because of that. I am going to stick with FBI. I think FBI was kind of disappointing for the first half of the split, but for him to come on at the end, I think that was huge. He was far and away the highest scoring player over the playoffs. That's why I'm going with FBI. And the Poddy goes to FBI. With 63% of the vote, the voters thought that his 40 points per game led them to the championship.
All right, so next up, we have the support of the year. So our nominees for this Poddy are going to be Vulcan at 29.9 points per game. Then we have Huhi, who had 26.3 points per game. Core JJ at 24.9 points per game. And then Poom at 22 points even. Who did you have for the Poddy of the year for the support role?
I can't get over the Poddy. I can't get over it. But for support of the year, I found it hard to get away from Vulcan. I think Core JJ, he scored okay, but he was disappointing compared to expectations. Poom was probably the highest difference from expectations, but he wasn't that good. A full 8 points per game behind Vulcan. I think it has to be Vulcan. Averaging almost 30 points per game from the support role is kind of crazy. He had a great split. That's why I chose Vulcan.
I do agree on all the points that you did make there. Poom definitely outperforming expectations. And I mean, Vulcan, like you mentioned, historically high numbers here for him, given that 29.9 points a game. So I think we're pretty much on the same page there as far as the winner here. But with 50% of the vote, it is solidified. Vulcan is going to win the Poddy of the year for the support position.
It was basically unanimous. The next award is going to go to the top laner of the year. Our nominees: Evil Genius's Impact, averaged 29 points per game. 100 Thieves Someday at 27.4 points per game. We've got Bwippo at 26.5 points per game. And we've got Fudge at 25.8 points per game. They were the top 4 top laners. Who are you voting for?
For my vote, I'm going to actually change it up a little bit here and go with Fudge, who did average, like you mentioned, at 25.8 points per game. I think that role swap really showed his diversity in his playstyle and what he ultimately brings to the team. Whichever team he's on, obviously he's only been with Cloud9 for this point, but I think he's definitely a good addition to that team. So my vote's going to be Fudge just because of the versatility and the leadership that he brings to that team.
Yeah, I think Fudge was a great pick. I think he delivered a little better than his average draft position suggested that he should have. My vote's going to go to Someday. I think he was the best top laner this year. I think 100 Thieves really played through him, which is something that not a lot of other top laners can say. I know Impact had the highest points per game, but it really felt like he was carried by his team. And I know in fantasy that doesn't really matter as much, but he definitely had a couple crazy low games. He died significantly more than any other of the top tier top laners. And so I think Someday was the best, and that's why I'm voting for Someday. And the Poddy goes to... It's Someday. Someday received 50% of the vote on Twitter at 27.4 points per game. He was voted the Fantasy Top Laner of the Year.
All right, next category we have the Jungler of the Year. So starting off with our nominees from the top, we have Inspired, who scored 32.5 points per game. We also had Santorin, who scored 26.7 points per game and also ended the year on a massive run and was the highest scoring playoff jungler in the league. We also had Blabber, who had 26.2 points per game, and Spica, who scored 22.5 points per game. So who did you have for the Poddy for the Jungler of the Year?
Yeah, I think this award has to go to Inspired. I really wanted to vote somewhere else. When I look at someone like Spica, obviously he was a full 10 points per game behind Inspired, but his average was significantly higher than the rest of his team. He was actually the number 6 jungler. The rest of his team was hovering around 7 or 8. And the crazy thing is he's actually scored more points than Jose, despite the fact that usually the fantasy production matches with the standings. And so I was tempted there. I was tempted by Santorin. He was pretty bad most of the year, but his last 5 games were so good that he led people to titles. I think that will play in people's brains. but I think the obvious answer has to be Inspired. He was 6 points per game higher than the next best. And he's going to be the MVP. He was so good. So I'm going for Inspired. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's really hard not to go Inspired just from all the points that you did mention. Again, having just a massive split, and just scoring the amount of points that he did, it's really hard, again, to not vote for Inspired. I mean, I do like Santorin as well. Obviously, significantly lower from a fantasy standpoint as far as the scoring goes. And I'm sure, like you mentioned, it's also going to play in people's minds how well of a year that he ended on. But again, I just feel like Inspired was just so great throughout. It's really hard to pick anybody else for the winner. So we'll go ahead and get right into it. The Poddie of the year for the jungler position with 67% of the vote goes to Inspired, and it is well deserved.
When you look at those games like his Vi game where he just destroyed C9, I mean, just such good stuff from Inspired this year. Very well deserved. All right, we are getting towards the end here. The next award goes to the mid laner of the year. Our nominees. First is Jojo Pyun. He averaged 31.5 points per game. Bjergsen, 30 points per game. Awadage at 29.3 points per game. And Jensen at 28.5 points per game. Those are our nominees. Who did you vote for?
Yeah, so my vote for is going to be Bjergsen. I just feel like he played such a massive role on that TL team. Definitely with the 30 points there, did finish second overall in points per game, just slightly behind JoJo. But again, I just feel like the role that he played, he was definitely the leader of the team for sure. Second in kills for the year, and just a massive stat that I feel like is often overlooked is the amount of deaths that he had. He averaged just barely over 1 a game. I mean, not many players can say they did that through the split. So my vote is going to go for Bjergsen.
Yeah, 19 deaths in 18 games is unbelievable. I think that's a really good choice. I'm actually tempted to go with Jensen. And I know he was all the way down at 4th for the year, but the thing with Jensen's year, he had some really, really great games. We already talked about his Anivia game, but I think he broke 53 times. And so he was unbelievable in his games that he was good. He definitely had some down weeks, which is why he's down at 4th, but he actually had the most kills of any mid laner this split at 69, which was 7 more than Bjergsen, who was second. So I'm voting for Jensen. The Poddie for the mid laner of the year goes to... It's Bjergsen. This was by far the closest vote on Twitter. He only had 13% of the vote, but he was still able to pull it out. He had a great year. The most consistent mid laner, 30 points per game. Bjergsen, well deserved.
All right, next up we have the 80 carry of the year, and let's get right into the nominees. First, we have Danny, who had 35.4 points per game. Then we had FBI with 31.5 points per game. We also had Luger, who had 27.8 points per game, and then Johnson, who finished with 27.1 points per game. All of these nominees definitely well deserving of the award, but ultimately only one could win. Who did you have taking home the Poddie for the best 80 carry of the year?
Well, when I look at these nominees, I look at Johnson, who was actually second in points over halfway through the split, but then fell off really bad at the end of the split. I look at Luger, who was probably the lowest picked 80 carry in the league. He probably did not start on rosters. You probably picked him up in free agency, and he finished 4th at 27.8 points per game. That is incredible. I look at FBI, who ended the year on such a great run, but there's no answer other than Danny. He was 35.4 points per game. That's 4 points clear of second place. He was so consistent. His pop-off games were incredible. He actually broke the record for the highest DPM, that's damage per minute, in the history of the LCS. I think it has to be Danny.
Yeah, I think that's a really strong pick, and numbers-wise would just make absolute sense, which is why I'm also going to be picking Danny in here. I do want to touch on also Luger, who you mentioned. I feel like he had a year that was definitely inspiring. Moving on to further splits, we'll see what he can do with that CLG team. See if he can continue, being as good as he has been, and just really see what he can, become. I mean, I feel like we know what Johnson's going to be or has been, I should say. Same with FBI. So always looking for that player to just take a deeper dive and see what they may potentially do in this league, moving forward. Okay, and so the winner for the Poddie for the AD carry of the year with 63% of the vote is going to be Danny. No surprise really here. Very well deserving.
This brings us to our last award of the night. It is the Fantasy MVP. This is the one we've been waiting for. Let's get right to the nominees. The first nominee, it's Danny, AD carry for Evil Geniuses at 35.4 points per game. Second is Inspired, the jungler for Evil Geniuses, 32.5 points per game. Third nominee is Bjergsen at 30 points per game. And the final nominee is FBI from 100 Thieves at 31.5 points per game. Who is your vote for Fantasy MVP?
So I feel like you can make a case for all four of these players to be the Fantasy MVP, and I do feel like Inspired will win the split MVP, just from how well he did during the split. But for Fantasy MVP, I'm actually going to go with Danny. He is clearly the number one player when it comes to fantasy, and for that reason, very simple reason, I'm going to give him my vote for the Fantasy MVP of the split.
That's definitely fair. When I look at Inspired, I think Inspired is the only one who has a really sound argument for MVP other than Danny. Inspired finished 6 points per game higher than second place, which is actually a huge gap. It's actually bigger than the gap between Danny and FBI, which is only 4 points. So I think you could get a little more value out of Inspired. That being said, Danny's 35.4 points per game are hard to beat. I don't think you can vote against it. I also vote for Danny. And the final Poddie, the Fantasy MVP, goes to... It's Danny. With 75% of the Twitter vote, with both of our votes, with an absolutely incredible summer split, Danny is your Fantasy LCS MVP. Alright, that will do it for our Fantasy Awards show. Thank you so much for those of you who joined in and voted on Twitter. If you guys think our picks sucked, if you think we left out a nominee, let us know. Tweet at us. It's at LFLpod. You can shoot us an email. It's at lflfantasypodcast@gmail.com. Biscuit, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I mean, we definitely want to hear back from you. I always love getting into, I don't want to call them arguments, but, passionate discussions, let's call them, on Twitter regarding anything fantasy related. We'd definitely love to hear from you guys just to get your thoughts and ideas. As always looking to make the podcast even better. So if you think there's stuff that we can improve on, feel free to let us know so we can continue to work towards having the best product that we can.
Hey, Biscuit, what kind of idiot would vote for fudge? Really?
I don't know. Maybe I just got hungry.
That's what I want to hear from people on Twitter. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, we appreciate everything you guys are doing, communicating with us. Hope to see you guys in Chicago for the LCS Finals. Super excited about that. Love to meet up. Thank you so much for listening. This is Pistons Wish and Ferris Biscuit signing off. Peace out.
See ya.